I'm your chunky messiah, Ethan, and I'm just here with another one of them there videos about Vampire the Masquerade. Indeed, yes, another episode in the rambling guide to Vampire the Masquerade V20. Visual aid. This is V5, not the edition we're talking about. It's just the only one I have a physical copy of. Whoopah! One day I'll play that. I've read it, but one day I'll play it. Anyway, this time I'm going to be doing a bit of a left turn from what I was doing before, because I said I was going to be doing a lot of the clan videos, and indeed I'd started that last time with the clan Malkavian. My original plan was to talk about the Chemise next. However, I essentially realised it's probably a bad idea, considering how bad I am at motivating myself, to talk immediately about my two favourite clans back to back, and then be faced with a bunch of clans that I either think are alright, kind of like, or in the case of a couple of them, absolutely despise. So I've decided that I'm going to do a different clan, one that I absolutely despise next. However, that does mean I'm going to need to do a bit more research than I'm used to, because quite frankly, I'll give you a spoiler, it's the Ravnos. I regularly forget the Ravnos exist. I do not like the Ravnos. They are... I won't get into it. I do not like the Ravnos, but I'm going to do them next, so I'm going to have to do some research. And hey, who knows, maybe I'll find something I like about the Ravnos. Probably not, though. They are the worst. Okay, this time I'm going to, as I said, be taking a rather dramatic left turn from talking about that, and I'm going to be talking about basically doing an introduction to the factions and more or less how they work in Vampire the Masquerade. Now, I am, of course, specifically going to be talking about the big three. There are countless factions in the world, depending on how you want to look at them. You could argue certain clans are factions. You could definitely argue certain bloodlines are factions. The Giovanni clan is definitely a faction in and of itself. It's independent of the major three. The Tremere, while not being independent of the major three factions, is definitely a faction unto itself within the Camarilla. You also have, the various, little bloodlines and different little organizations that exist within the various factions and all this kind of gubbins. It can get very complicated. It's a very long rabbit hole. Again, you also actually have the Assamites and the followers of Set independents who function essentially as their own factions, but who are just on a much smaller scale than the big three. But if I was to sit here and talk about those, I would literally be here for hours upon hours, because there's a lot of obscure, nerdy detail I could go into about all the various smaller factions, especially the ones I particularly like. So this is going to be serving as an introduction to the big three, how they're related to each other, and how they behave. I'm not going to be getting too much into their history, because I want to save that for essentially any of the videos I make about them specifically. But let's go into the big three. So, in the world of Vampire the Masquerade, in what is often referred to as the Jihad, there are three major players that more or less account for the vast majority of the vampiric population of Earth. I would go so far as to say that's probably about 80 to 90% of vampires fall under one of these three brackets, with the rest of them being the independents, who exist either outside of this because they are, as mentioned before, an independent faction, such as the Assamites or the followers of Set or the Giovanni, or they are, thin bloods, or they're just kind of clanless. There is a word for that, but I've immediately forgotten what it is. Actually, hang on a minute. Caitiff. Check the book. It's Caitiff. I knew there was a word and I knew it began with C, but I couldn't remember which one it was. But yes, Caitiff, who are literally clanless vampires who aren't necessarily thin bloods, but who generally tend to just kind of be on the fringes of society. That makes up the last 20 to 10% of vampires. So, going in terms of essentially which ones are going to be interacting with the most in your standard game of Vampire the Masquerade, the ones which are just going in order of which one's most prevalent. I will start with essentially your vanilla faction, the standard of the three, vanilla Camarilla. That's it, the Camarilla, who I believe, though, do not quote me on this, because I'm not sure the exact numbers. I'm not even sure if there are exact numbers, but the vast majority of vampires, well, the majority of vampires in the world belong to the Camarilla. Now, the Camarilla is essentially a centuries-old organization of vampires, kind of like a secret society as far as humans are concerned, but essentially the public face as far as vampires are concerned, of modern Kindred. The Camarilla is structured somewhat feudally. with each city that is under the control of the Camarilla being ruled over by a prince, and then the individual clans of the Camarilla being ruled in each city by a primogen that act essentially as kind of a council of viziers to the prince. Now, there are, of course, other positions within the Camarilla. There is, of course, the Harpy, which is depending on which city you're in, an either completely official or semi-official or essentially unofficial trend setter and news voice, basically official court gossiper for the prince. You also have the sheriff, who is essentially the justice of the prince, big scary guy whose job it is to kill people or beat up people who are getting out of line, depending on how far out of line they've gone. Again, Magilla Gorilla from Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, he is the sheriff of that city. He's also a Nagaloper, which is an African bloodline, not traditionally part of the Camarilla, that bloodline, but and also because I believe they're somewhat related to the Shmisei, so that's wild. But he is a Nagaloper. Baffling one, that one. Really baffling. There are, of course, other ones. There's also the Scourge some cities have, which is a guy whose job is literally to go around executing anyone under a certain generation. I believe it's basically if you're in double digits in terms of your generation, dead you go. The Camarilla essentially presents itself as civilized vampire society, and they are, depending on how you look at it, probably by far the largest of the factions, if only because they are the only faction that explicitly claims that all vampires are technically part of the Camarilla. They position themselves as the government and the police of all vampires, and kind of position the Sabbat and the Anarchs, who are the other two major factions, as being, to varying degrees, rebels or enemies of society as a whole. There are a few clans which are explicitly part of the Camarilla, which you would essentially be considered a traitor to your clan if you were not a member of the Camarilla as these clans, which is, anti-tribu. Basically, if you're a member of the Sabbat and you're also a member of one of these clans, you are a traitor. Those are the Malkavians, the Nosferatu, the Ventru, not the Shmisei, fuck me. The Nosferatu, the Malkavians, the Ventru, the Toreador, the Tremere, the Bruja, and the Gangrel. Is that 7? Yes, it is. I can count good with numbers, like. I'm trying to think of what else to do with to talk about with the Camarilla, actually. They have a very specific set of laws, which you are not allowed to break. The highest of these laws, by far, is the Masquerade, which is in the title of the game. The Masquerade being essentially the law that we do not allow humans to know that vampires exist, taking the view that even though an individual vampire is far, far stronger and far, far more dangerous than any individual human, the sheer numbers of humanity would lead them to be able to easily wipe out vampires should they ever discover that vampires exist. And also, they believe that humans will wipe them out if humans en masse ever discover they exist. They have evidence for this. There was an Inquisition at one point that almost wiped out all of the vampires. Wiped out huge swaths of the Elders, which I can't, again, I'm trying to not get into the history, but either the Sabbat or the Anarchs were formed because of that Inquisition in the first Anarch revolt. I believe the Sabbat came out of one of the Anarch revolts, and the actual Anarchs came out of the other one, but they're both called Anarch revolts. I need to do more research into that one, because that's a bit I've always been quite hazy on. But the Camarilla is a very old organisation, as I say. They have a lot of rules. They also have the rules of domain, which essentially gives people formal claims to territory that you have to respect. And various other rules that they will basically inflict punishments on you if you break, regardless of whether or not you've ever officially sworn loyalty to the Camarilla. Essentially, the only reason they will not treat you as a citizen of their little kind of personal world government is if you essentially have the political backing to give them reason to not be able to just step on you. A random vampire claiming he's not a member of the Camarilla and flaunting their laws, he's probably going to get killed. A bunch of Anarchs not paying attention to certain laws, they're probably not going to get killed en masse. There's too many of them to deal with. And say if you're the Giovanni, you're too valuable to be specifically fucked with or to be subjected to Camarilla oversight. Same with, not necessarily the followers of Set. I believe they will try and inflict themselves on the followers of Set, but that's because the followers of Set do not move in quite so large groups. That's the Camarilla. The Sabbat, I'm saving the Anarchs, the Sabbat are essentially the antithesis of the Camarilla, where the Camarilla views itself as civilized and a world government, and also actually specifically the Camarilla views itself as it puts a lot of stock by essentially attempting to maintain the humanity of vampires to keep them to some degree or another moral. The Sabbat completely throw that out of the window. Whereas the Camarilla are more or less a secular organization that completely denies the existence of Cain and the antediluvians and believes that the Nodism, as it's called, the Nodist views, Nodist prophecy is nonsense. The Sabbat completely buy into the idea of Gehenna and the end of the world, and their response to that is to act like absolute monsters. The Camarilla supports and holds up the existence of old hierarchies of elders and all this kind of nonsense, these very old hierarchies that essentially are the oppressive thing which keeps, the old in power and the young weak. The Sabbat technically are against that kind of structure. They do not believe that elders should be worshipped. Indeed, they believe elders should be consumed. Whereas the Camarilla considers the act of diablerie, the act of literally consuming the soul of another vampire to claim their power, to be the greatest sin you can commit, which will immediately get a blood hunt called on you. And if you don't know what a blood hunt is, it's literally open season. Do whatever you want to this guy, lads. He broke the big one. The Camarilla will declare a blood hunt if you diablerize. The Sabbat actively encourages it. The Sabbat have very few laws. However, they very few formal laws. However, they do, to one degree or another, follow their own version of the Masquerade. I can't quite remember what it's called, although notably they only follow that in cities controlled by themselves. If the Camarilla has majority dominance in a city, the Sabbat will actively try to break the Masquerade in that area, because that's going to reflect largely on the Camarilla and frustrate them. However, in their own cities, they more or less enforce their own notion of the Masquerade. While they have fewer formal laws, they do have a lot of informal understanding. They essentially are structured around a series of pacts, which are led by pack priests who are bound together by blood rituals, which forces them all to essentially be blood bonded to each other, that is, emotionally invested in each other's continued existence. And they essentially act as raiders, generally, most of the time when you're going to see them. As I say, they are violent, they are vehement worshippers, well, not worshippers, but vehement adherents to the Nodist prophecy of Gehenna, and they believe that it is their solemn duty to seek out and destroy all of the antediluvians and to basically shatter the bindings of the blood that control, later generations, allow elders to manipulate the blood of later generations to suit their own ends. Now, despite this, the Sabbat are also massive hypocrites, because much like the Camarilla, which has, its structure of princes, the Sabbat has a structure of bishops and archbishops, who are generally older vampires, because they're just more powerful, and in such a violent civilization, in such a violent faction, the stronger you are, the more power you tend to have. It's also worth noting that much like in the Camarilla, where the princes are almost always Ventru, in the Sabbat, the bishops and archbishops are almost always Chemise and La Sombra. There is essentially a class structure in this in this group that technically opposes all kind of class structure. They're also, much like the Camarilla is secretly ruled by a shadowy cabal of people, distant vampires that no one will ever know the faces of. So is the Sabbat, except they've got two layers of it. The Sabbat are massively hypocritical. However, they are also essentially the villains of the series, so they're essentially allowed to get away with that. The Sabbat also functions in multiple levels, as I said. It has the false Sabbat, which is the ones that you are most likely going to see. To use an example from Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, those gangrels who attack you en masse, especially early on in the game, those would be the false Sabbat, the shovel heads, as they're called, people who were almost literally whacked over the head, turned into vampires, stuck in a hole in the ground and used as shock troops. Those are the false Sabbat. They're placed into packs. They are usually deliberately starved, so that they are absolutely blood-crazed. They frenzy all the time. They do not follow the path of humanity and do not deliberately keep no real hold on humanity. They tend to follow paths of other kinds, which makes them kind of alien and monstrous to be around, because they are all incredibly low humanity. But yeah, the false Sabbat, they don't know what's going on. They don't care about the philosophy of the Sabbat. All they know is that All they basically know is fuck the Camarilla, and I want to drink some blood. That's the false Sabbat. Above them, you have the true Sabbat, the ones who have been turned properly. Essentially, the ones who would have been turned in a kind of similar way to the Camarilla, who have the rites of siring, where you essentially need to get permission in order to sire a new vampire. The Sabbat have a similar thing, but that's just how you get into the true Sabbat. I believe you can be essentially promoted from the false Sabbat into the true Sabbat, but that's not particularly common. The true Sabbat actually know what the goals of the Sabbat are, or at least what the goals of the Sabbat seem to be. And yeah, they have more of a political and ideological and philosophical reason for opposing the Camarilla than the kind of crude, fuck y'all motherfuckers, fuck the police response of the false Sabbat. Above them, you have the ruling council of the Sabbat, the Black Hand, a bunch of mysterious elders who are secretly directing the bishops and archbishops. They are indeed above the bishops and archbishops. The bishops and archbishops are, I believe, members of the true Sabbat. Although some of them are members of the Black Hand. No one actually knows who the Black Hand are. And hilariously, above the Black Hand, you have the true Black Hand, who are an even more secretive cabal of even more elder Sabbat vampires, who are secretly manipulating the secret council of the Black Hand, who are secretly manipulating the true Sabbat, who are themselves secretly manipulating the false Sabbat. It's bullshit and hypocrisy all the way down with the Sabbat. However, once again, they are the setting's bad guys, despite the fact that, amusingly, they are completely correct. In their belief that the antediluvians are wanting to destroy the world and they need to be destroyed. That is true. Most of them do want to destroy the world and do need to be destroyed. Actually, no, that's not fair. The antediluvians don't necessarily want to destroy the world, it's just they will accidentally because they don't really care. They are an apocalyptic threat, the antediluvians, and the Sabbat are correct. However, the way the Sabbat go about dealing with it is by essentially being more or less a massive terrorist organization whose primary goal seems to be to more or less harass the Camarilla. They're evil. They're evil and they're all monsters. And then the last one is the Anarchs. Now, the Anarchs are a bit of a peculiar one to talk about because despite the fact that they are regarded as a faction, they're not really? They're not really a faction, the Anarchs. Officially, almost all Anarchs are considered members of the Camarilla, especially by the Camarilla, although the Anarchs themselves do not necessarily like that or agree with that. The Anarchs essentially believe that all vampires should be free. There should not be any of these kind of large-scale, rigid structures like the Camarilla and the Sabbat. They basically are just fiercely independent, but aren't technically independents because they are almost like the rebellious children of the Camarilla. The Anarchs, by the way, are actually a lot more common, if I recall correctly, in America than they are in Europe, because the Camarilla have a fucking tight grip on most of Europe. Whereas in America, there was a lot, the structures are a lot more new, so the Anarchs essentially were allowed to get a lot more control there. In fact, LA is, before the events of Vampire Masquerade Bloodlines, it's an Anarch-free state. The Camarilla are relatively new there. And a lot of the time, in fact, in the United States, over the last couple of hundred years, since vampires really started taking off in the States, a lot of it has been the Sabbat and Camarilla essentially trying to impose their will on the local Anarch populations. Regardless of this, however, the Anarchs do tend to have leaders of some description or another. Either they have unofficial leaders, an example of which would be Nines Rodriguez in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, who does not hold any formal title and does not hold any formal domain, as far as I can tell, but is considered a leader by force of, I think the game reckons it's charisma, but I've never thought Nines was a particularly charismatic character, but I think that's how he's supposed to be in charge. He's supposed to be a charismatic leader. Could have written him better. It's one of the few times that I think the writing of that game falls down, is the fact that Nines is just a really boring non-entity of a character. I don't like the Anarchs. I don't know if there's... I don't hate the Sabbat. I don't like the Anarchs. You know what I mean? I'm a Camarilla boy. I'm a Cape. I'm a Cammy. That's my view. But yeah, sometimes, however, they do have some kind of very loose formal structure. Barons, I believe, is the name that they will use for essentially Anarchs who hold large amounts of territory. But again, the barons are not answerable to anyone. That is essentially just a term that's being used to describe more or less an independent ruler of a large amount of territory. As such, they have very few specific rules. In fact, they believe they should have none. But despite that, theoretically, they follow a lot of the same rules as the Camarilla. It's just they don't have someone whose job is to explicitly enforce it. I'm going to make a video talking about why I don't like the Anarchs, and I'm trying to not go off on rants right now in this one, because I very easily could do. They are a faction. They are a very big, notable faction in the world. However, they have very little formal structure, and I'm going to save the rest of it, the rest of my opinions on that for another video, because I have a lot. I do not like the Anarchs. As the name suggests, they're anarchists. Unlike the Camarilla and the Sabbat, it's very on the nose what they are. They do tend to be young, though. I will give them that, actually. They are not as knee-deep in hypocrisy as the Sabbat, because while both of them kind of agree that elders shouldn't be in charge of everything, the Sabbat still have multiple levels of secretive elders in charge of everything. The Anarchs don't, because they genuinely have no formal structure. While you do often have notable elders who are often power players within Anarch territory, that's not an inherent part of how they behave, and there is no formal structure around them deliberately supporting that, like there is with the Sabbat and the Camarilla. An example of this actually would be Jack, Smiling Jack from Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. He's not like the eldest of elders, but he was a pirate. He's from the Golden Age of Sail, so he would be considered an elder, and he is an important figure. However, he holds no formal power over the rest of the local Anarch population. Whereas I believe the Baron of Hollywood is considerably younger than Jack, and does hold considerably more power. And in fact, again, Nines Rodriguez, he's from the Great Depression, and he holds considerably more power than Jack does. Okay, that's it for the actual descriptions. I'm going to actually quickly talk about how they function, because this is one of the peculiar things about Vampire the Masquerade and about the way their factions work. While these factions do have large-scale control, as I said, the Camarilla control most of Europe and large swaths of the Americas, they don't actually behave as large factions in the way you might necessarily expect. It's probably easier to refer to them as philosophies rather than actual factions, or almost like modes of government, like communism and capitalism. You know, there wasn't a king capitalism or a captain communism. During the Cold War, there were, like, holdouts, notable examples of them, but it wasn't as if one guy commanded, all of them. They didn't move as an organised force. It was just ideological and political opinions that kind of fell into line there. That's kind of how it works in Vampire the Masquerade. While there are shadowy groups of elders who no one ever sees, I can't remember the name of them, they do have a specific name in the Camarilla, that no one ever sees, that exist above the prince, they don't actually interfere that much. And again, while the Black Hand and the True Black Hand are essentially this globe-spanning organisation, that doesn't mean that the factions actually behave as a unified whole. Essentially, all of the factions, including the Anarchs, behave like city-states that just share multiple Camarilla cities. They don't move as a nation. They operate as a bunch of semi-allied, largely autonomous city-states that just have almost identical forms of government and philosophy. Same with the Sabbat, to the point at which, actually, they're so self-contained, these kind of ecosystems of vampires, that you could literally have a Camarilla city and a Sabbat city, obviously it's very rare for two cities to be next to each other, but, have the next nearest city be Sabbat. And it's not necessarily... They're not necessarily going to fight each other. They're going to be dealing with what's going on in their own cities, because there's inevitably going to be, a Camarilla presence in the Sabbat city, and a Sabbat presence in the Camarilla city. Not necessarily from their neighbours, just separately within their own ecosystems, and they're going to be dealing with that. This is largely because it's very difficult for vampires to move across large stretches of space, especially in the modern day, which I know seems crazy, but essentially in a lot of cases in a lot of the cities, they're surrounded by werewolves, so you can't walk outside of them, because as a vampire, because you'll get eaten, and you can't necessarily drive out of them because you'll get eaten, because a car will not stop a werewolf, and that leaves the main form of transportation for vampires being planes, and it's kind of hard to only move at night with planes, because especially in the modern nights, because they're really like. There's a lot of security, so it's kind of suspicious to... It's kind of difficult to move with no suspicion travelling at night, so these cities essentially act as islands, completely cut off from one another except for very small-scale movements. So they are essentially a bunch of city-states. That's just something that's worth noting. While the Sabbat and the Camarilla do have large power over large swaths of land, they don't normally interact with each other. In fact, they don't normally interact with each other's, with... They don't do city-to-city fighting. It's basically fighting over different cities. It more or less honestly functions like a war of ideology, which I suppose is why it's called the Jihad, rather than the Crusade. Because that's kind of, at least to me, that's more what that word implies. Whereas a crusade would imply entire armies of people going to beat each other's cities up. A war of essentially small-scale ideological battles for essentially the souls of the various cities that dot the world. That's what's going on. As I said, they're city-states. They're city-states who are roughly aligned. You do get small amounts of travel between the different cities, but it's almost never en masse. So there's almost never an invasion. It has happened occasionally. You do get numbers of vampires coming from other cities to take them over in the name of their factions, but that is very rare. So generally, it's going to be operating in terms of city-states. Now, because of this, and because while there is technically oversight for at least the Camarilla and the Sabbat, that oversight isn't massively strong. I believe there is a role in the Camarilla called I think it's a Justicar, who is essentially answerable to this council that's in charge of the Camarilla, who can turn up and get rid of a prince if the prince is being so notably batshit and terrible that this council deems it necessary to get rid of him. But honestly, except for the most extreme of circumstances, they're going to just be doing whatever. And of course, the Black Hand, while they, I believe, do not have a formal role for that, the Black Hand will move to remove an archbishop who is doing the same thing. But essentially within the cities, the actual structure of them, while they will follow the vague pattern of the Sabbat or the Camarilla, if they're controlled by the Sabbat or the Camarilla, they are not going to be identical. They're going to be similar, and the situation is going to be unique to each city. Because that's just how it works. They're city-states who are part of the same factions, but all that means is that they have very similar ideals and very similar forms of government and very similar philosophies to the way vampires should be behaving. Okay, 26 minutes. Not as long as I thought. I think that's more or less it in terms of the major factions. Quick summary, the Sabbat are essentially crazy religious zealots or crazy fuckwits, depending on which way you look at it, who are trying to eat everyone and kill everyone in order to stop the world from ending. The Camarilla are the vampire authority. They are vampire society who are going to make you behave whether you like it or not. And the Anarchs are anarchists. Yeah. And they're all city-states that essentially don't interact with their allied cities all that much. They're kind of self-contained ecosystems, because that's just kind of because they're all surrounded by werewolves, and it's hard to travel by plane if you're a vampire. Okay. I will, at some point, go into more detail about the Sabbat and the Anarchs and the Camarilla. You know what? I'm literally going to make the video about the Anarchs. I'm going to take a break to basically let my voice calm itself, because I'm getting a bit of a sore throat because I've been talking non-stop for half an hour. But I'm literally going to do that. But yeah, so expect that video soon. I'm not sure how much gap, maybe a week gap between this video and that one. But I will talk about the Camarilla and Sabbat, because there is a lot of detail that I could go into with them. I will talk more about them in a future video. I'm going to be doing in a future video, 2 future videos, 1 for each, and I'll be talking about the Anarchs, specifically why I hate them, in the next video. But yeah, hopefully that helped you learn a bit. I should say, actually, I know I've already done this disclaimer, but I'll do kind of a post disclaimer as well, that the situation in V5, very different, in that essentially, the Camarilla has gotten a lot more restrictive in V5, and has started declaring people Anarchs, so it's not just kind of a self-identifying thing, it's essentially what the Camarilla use to officially declare people not part of the Camarilla, which they're doing a lot of, because essentially there was a Second Inquisition, where a lot of vampires got killed by humans, so they panicked and got a lot more closed off. The Anarchs, as such, are a hell of a lot bigger and a hell of a lot more powerful, and are, rather than the Sabbat, are now the main agitator to the Camarilla, and the Sabbat have more or less kind of slunk off into the darkness and become boogeymen, rather than this kind of big prevalent force. They're frightening and they're secretive, but no one knows where they are or what they're doing at any given time. That's what's going on in V5, although the whole city-states thing does still apply. It's just the Camarilla and the Anarchs and the Sabbat are all acting kind of differently in that setting. I am looking forward to see how V5 deals with that. That also, actually, because specifically the Camarilla has stopped basically claiming everyone as part of the Camarilla in that does lead to a lot more minor factions, especially city-specific minor factions, which is kind of interesting. I do actually like that as a point, because it means that, yeah, there's a lot more Anarchs, but within those Anarchs, there's a shitload of independent factions with their own philosophies, which is quite interesting. And again, it's something I'm looking forward to in VTMB too. Okay, look forward to the video of me talking about the Anarchs in V20 and why I fucking despise them, coming up soon. I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope it was informative, but that's gonna be all from me for now.